Daniel Plainview is an oil man, as he's apt to make us aware, but he wasn't always that way. The opening minutes of There Will Be Blood are dedicated to a much younger Plainview. It is 1898 and Daniel Plainview is a prospector. Aside from a brief remark, he remains silent for the entirety of his opening. It's a subtle gesture, but in an opening characterised by its restraint, it can't help but stand out. Incited by a piece of silver, Plainview whimpers in exultation. There she is, he laments. There she is. It is a hollow victory. Stuck underground, alone, Plainview has suffered from a debilitating fall. His black, haggard frame convulses in pain as he ascends into the light. Aside from a limp that will plague him for the remainder of the film, he emerges unscathed. Reminiscing over the events later, he brushes it aside. I don't like to explain myself, he says. Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood is a singular character study that is unrivaled in this century. In this video, I will attempt to excavate its depths and deconstruct Anderson's approach to character in hopes of determining what makes it feel so unique, both in the context of his career and as a canonical piece of modern cinema. Flash forward to 1902. Plainview is still taciturn, albeit no longer for the sake of silver. He is an oil man, after all. It is important that Anderson introduces Plainview to us as an ordinary man. In spite of his stature, he is still a man of flesh and blood, but the blood of Plainview is viscous and black. It is crude and sickly. He's as slick as an oil spill and just as prone to ignite. And the vicissitudes of his character are captured in all their volcanic grandeur in Daniel Day-Lewis's iconic performance. Day-Lewis is a unique actor in this respect, as he is both ostentatious enough to uphold an air of theatricality, whilst remaining nuanced enough to retain the humanity inherent in Plainview's character. In spite of all of his flaws, Plainview is not the Antichrist, and this is precisely what makes him so hard to portray. This is also one reason why There Will Be Blood works so well as a character study, as the audience gets to see Plainview both from the perspective of how he wishes to be perceived, and in a series of more intimate moments that reveal who he truly is. This is testament not only to Day-Lewis's skill as an actor, but to the astuteness of Anderson's script. There are no monsters in There Will Be Blood, only men. Looking back over the work of Paul Thomas Anderson, a certain pattern appears to emerge. Most of his films tend to be structured around a single central relationship between two characters. We can observe this trend throughout his filmography, from his debut, Hard 8, which chronicles the evolving relationship between an expert gambler and his protege, to his latest film, Licorice Pizza, which explores the relationship between Alana, an aimless woman in her mid-20s, and Gary, an opportunistic teenager. The perspectives of Anderson's characters tend to come into conflict, and by the end of his films there is usually some kind of resolution in which one perspective either triumphs over another.
Do you understand, Eli? That's more to the point. Do you understand?
As is the case in There Will Be Blood, or coalesces into the other to create a compromise, as is the case in Phantom Thread. The genuine elation we witness when Plainview first chances upon oil is testament to his humanity. It may be the only time we see him smile, but he smiles nonetheless, evincing how he is not merely a construct of capitalism, but also a human being. Perhaps the best depiction of this approach to character comes in The Master. The first time that we meet its central enigma, Lancaster Dodd, he describes himself in the following terms to the audience.
I do many, many things. I am a writer, a doctor, a nuclear physicist, a theoretical philosopher. But above all, I am a man. Hopelessly inquisitive man, just like you.
On the one hand, it's easy to argue that Anderson's characters are constructs that are supposed to stand in for certain ideologies, but Lancaster Dodd explicitly rejects this reading in this scene and instead wishes to be perceived as what he is, a man. Nothing is ever as clear-cut as it seems in a Paul Thomas Anderson film, and in spite of their ideological conflicts, the relationships between his characters tend to feel real. It would be easy to argue that Daniel Plainview is a monster, but Anderson appears to reject such a simple reading and instead indicates to us in this scene that there is a lot more to his characters than that. We can observe a similar dynamic to the Master in There Will Be Blood. To see how this comes about, we can chart its plot and start to see the exact point that conflict first arises in the film. Near the start of the film, Plainview chances upon Paul Sunday, the less fanatic but equally opportunistic younger brother of the film's secondary protagonist, Eli. He is then directed to the town of Little Boston, where the bulk of the film's narrative takes place. This is where the central conflict of There Will Be Blood begins, when Plainview meets Eli, a young preacher who applies similar principles to Plainview, but in the context of organised religion, rather than capitalism. Upon first encountering Eli, Daniel is stupefied. The resemblance between the pair is more than uncanny, and he is visibly taken aback. Daniel later refers to Paul as a prophet of the pair.
It was Paul told me about you. He's the prophet. He's the smart one. You're just the afterbirth, Eli.
No.
Slithered out on your mother's filth.
No.
Afterbirth he may be, but if the film has a central antagonist, it isn't him. Eli is depicted as similar to Daniel in many respects, and can be seen as more of a stumbling block than anything else. Neither man is merely a construct, and is, at the end of the day, a man. This is why we can't simply say that one is good and one is bad, or one is right and one is wrong. In the absence of a clear antagonist, I think it becomes clear that the antithesis of There Will Be Blood is no mere man, but God. Like most Western epics, There Will Be Blood has an air of the Old Testament about it. Plainview's rich, magnetic drawl tends to inspire or intimidate all those who come into contact with it. He is a man of independent means, but his staunch individualism ultimately winds up getting him nowhere. He ends up rich, but once again, he is alone. It's hard to feel too bad for Plainview, however, as solitude is evidently favourable to him. As he notes in an earlier scene, he yearns to get away from everyone, to live alone, and to live comfortably. He reminisces about a house from his childhood, with the implication being that his perspective has been corrupted, to the point where he can no longer be content with the aspirations that he had in the past. In this respect, the life of the Christian certainly acts as an apt counterpoint to the life of the oil baron. Eli, self-centered though he may be, is an active member of his community, a self-described proud son of these hills. He strives to further his church for the sake of tightening his spiritual stranglehold over Little Boston. In spite of this, Eli is depicted as a hypocrite, and Daniel receives his retribution at the end of the film.
You can sit down again.
It's hard to decipher the film's iconic closing scene, but perhaps the most obvious thing is that it is indicative of the triumph of individualism. In the 21st century, capitalism has prevailed over Christianity as the preeminent thought process of America, and the film reflects this.
The Lord sometimes challenges us, doesn't he, Eli?
Oh, yes, he does. Daniel, yes, he does.
Yes, he doesn't.
He's completely failed to alert me to the recent panic in our economy.
We start to see the genesis of the capitalist principles that would come to drive the rise of secularism in society across the 20th century in There Will Be Blood, and in these scenes it is made apparent that they have done more to drive us apart than bring us together. This point is explored in Peter Bradshaw's 2010 retrospective, in which he proposes that we ought to interpret this film as a post-apocalyptic indication into our own exhausted future without oil, a topic that hits a little too close to home at the moment, as the world is caught in the throes of an international energy crisis. There Will Be Blood feels prescient in this respect, and its central argument appears to be that adopting a purely capitalistic perspective inevitably leads to isolation and misery, a fate that ultimately befalls both Daniel and Eli as their respective perspectives are corrupted throughout the film. It isn't explicitly pro-Christian, but it appears to indicate that we are better off together than alone. As the old adage goes, united we stand, divided we fall. It's easy to see that There Will Be Blood is about the rise of capitalism when we consider Anderson's decision to structure its narrative around the conflicting perspectives of Daniel and Eli. These perspectives come to act out a microcosm of the conflict between capitalism and religion, whilst also giving us an indication into the character and motivations of both men. Because that's what they both are at the end of the day. Men. Men who are searching for meaning. Men who, like Lancaster Dodd, are intrepid and curious. Paul Thomas Anderson's body of work may be eclectic, but it's easy to see the similarities between his works, both in terms of their structure and ideology. He has been compared to Kubrick in this respect, and it's easy to see why. Both directors were preoccupied with the male character, and strove to understand how and why many men are the way they are. This is why Anderson's decision to incorporate a feminine perspective into his two most recent films feels like such a big step forward for the director. I do love There Will Be Blood, but I would go as far as to say that Phantom Thread is a better film in this respect, as the inclusion of Alma's perspective does more to critique the social structure that gives an outlet to a figure like Reynolds or Plainview than There Will Be Blood could ever do, seeing as it structures its conflict around the perspectives of two male characters. I for one am eager to see where Anderson goes next, as I think that his two most recent works have been two of his most conceptually interesting to date. Thank you for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed.